Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Agnieszka Gmys-Wiktor, and I am a program officer here at NED. On behalf of the endowment, I would like to welcome everyone and thank everyone for coming. I also would like to thank my colleagues from the Europe team and from Public Affairs for helping to organize this event. The global order built by the United States and other democracies after World War II is under threat. In many regions throughout the world, authoritarian forces have stepped up their efforts to undermine democratic standards and values and are targeting regional and international institutions that are critical for safeguarding democratic norms. In Central and Eastern Europe, recent backsliding has brought the realization that there is a need to re-examine assumptions about the region's transitions, particularly as Russia, in the aftermath of the Maidan revolution in Ukraine, has escalated its efforts to discredit liberal democracy, undermine Western unity, and fuel populism and nationalism in the region. For the past several years, the endowment has focused on better understanding Russia's role in destabilizing democratic transitions in and unity among EU aspirants, candidates, and new member states. The endowment has monitored Russian support for extremist movements and illiberal elements, as well as tracked Russia's use of soft power tools, such as disinformation, to destabilize the political, economic, and social climate in the region. Through NED-supported research and programming, which promotes international and regional cooperation among journalists, analysts, and researchers, decision makers and the general public have access to more information, facilitating an understanding of Russia's influence and role in undermining democracy in Europe. Today's event, which we are proud to host, is the product of such regional collaboration among analysts and researchers from Central and Eastern Europe. The in-depth research they conducted to assess how Russia is using its energy to exert political and social influence in Romania, Hungary, Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus has clearly identified Moscow's strategies and channels of influence common to the entire region. Most importantly, the research has also enabled the analysts to propose methods of addressing the common challenges in a coordinated and efficient manner. We will learn more in the two panels that will follow. For now, I would like to give the floor to Sorin Ionica, who's the head of the leading Romania-based think tank Expert Forum. Sorin and his staff have played a crucial role in spearheading this research, identifying project partners, assisting them in producing reports, analyzing regional findings, and offering solutions. Once again, thank you very much, and here's Sorin.
Thank you very much, Agnieszka. Thank you, first of all, NED, for the support for this project, which is not very easy to carry out. And thank you, in general, the American friends who have supported the transition in Eastern Europe in the last decades. Actually, we will be talking a lot about Eastern Europe today in the country chapters, whether member states or non-member states. And this is an area which unfortunately has become interesting again in the last years. And in the worst sense, it is interesting, but probably is not noticed how interesting it is. And this is probably the worst situation you can have, because Eastern Europe has been, for decades, if not for centuries, very much influenced to the trends in Western Europe, in the big capitals in Western Europe. We'll be talking also about energy a lot today. And of course, this is a very important strategic sector, policy sector in which the stakes are very high. But this is just a zoom in that we do today in the country chapters of a broader problem. And the wider problem is actually the struggle which continues between two models of governance. And this is what our story is about at the end of the day. So we have an illustration on energy of a wider story. This is a story of unfinished transition, or if you want, unfinished modernization of these states, more or less, depends what kind of historical tradition every one of us inherited when the communists collapsed almost 30 years ago. We come from the past with governance, administrative and policy mechanisms which were not exactly as they should be. And today we see again research for 20 years or 25 years, it looked like there was no alternative, at least in theory, and there was no ethical alternative to finishing the modernization process and getting a modern Western, market, pro-market state. In the last years, we started to have doubts. And this is what we are discussing today. You'll see a lot of variability between states because traditions, institutional setting, and the past dependence play a very important role. And you'll see the struggle, as I said, between these two models. The illiberal model, or we can say the old tradition of governing in our region, which is very much based on formal and informal institution bargains, soft budget constraints, weak institution, gray areas within a country or in relationship between countries, and of course the divide and rule games played by the big power of the region, which used to be the Soviet Union. Today it tends to be Russia, the Kremlin. And the new liberal model, which all of us tend to associate more or less with the European Union, which for all its flaws, it stands for clear set of rules applicable uniformly to everyone, whether you are a small state or a big state, predictable rules to follow, stable institutions, and a game which is based on mutual benefits. We are there. We see these two models clashing again, while in the 90s we thought that the game was over. And we will analyze today, using the case of energy, what are the stakes of this in this struggle, and how various countries, societies, polities play a role in this geographic pattern of variability. Because Eastern Europe is very, very different. But all these external pressures contribute to a lot of uncertainty in the region nowadays. And I will stop here because I don't want to anticipate the real content of the presentations, which will be the country case studies, but we'll have a section in the end where we tend to summarize and to draw conclusions which might be applicable to the whole region as such. Thank you, and now I pass the word to the moderator.
Thank you very much, Sorin, and welcome to our conference. We have a full table today, as you can see. We're going to be discussing case studies regarding 5 countries: Hungary, Romania, Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine. Because we truly believe that no country is safe unless the region is safe. And as you'll see, there are a lot of differences, but there are also a lot of similarities between the countries, or at least similar challenges that each of them responds in a particular way. We'll have to say that we saw a lot of differences in the way countries handle regional challenges. And I think we tried to build the agenda on this assumption. We try to separate it in 2 blocks, one regarding EU member states and one regarding non-EU member states, to actually try to see what the impact of accession and being part of a larger union is, and the lack thereof. We'll start immediately with the presentation on Hungary of Mr. Deck. We'll try to stick to the schedule, so I'll ask each intervention to be not more than 7 minutes, assuming that it will in fact be 10. So we'll move to Hungary now. We're trying to keep enough time for the Q&A session. Please, Mr. Deck.
Okay, thank you very much, Laura. So I was restricted to 3 slides and 7 minutes in my speech, but you may find in the reports on the table the whole Hungarian case study, where in 4 constructing blocks we designed the Russian influence in Hungary. Very nice story. Basically, I have 4 observations for the today, even 2 general ones. The first general remark, that Hungary is a very good demonstration that the transition in Central Europe is a 2-way street. So you cannot take guarantee that the liberal market economies in the region will not backslide somewhere else. It's not a zigzag, it's not a temporary phenomenon. The second one is about the Russian influence in general. So unlike the post-Soviet states or even the Western Balkan countries, in the classical sense, but there were no elements of influence in Central Europe. These countries are institutionally anchored in the EU and the NATO. They are, in economic sense, foreign multinationals dominate their economy. They trade with the West, fundamentally belong to the Western economies. No economic footprint from Russia is to be seen in Hungary. No minorities, not a Slavic country, no historical fundamentals. And still in 10 years, they created some sort of influence in Hungary. So, well, all respect has to be given to the Kremlin in this regard. And the question remains, why? I don't think that it is only an energy phenomenon, but since this project was about energy, I will give 2 possible fulcrums for Russian influence in the energy field. Well, the first one is energy dependence has changed its nature in the region and also in Hungary, but it is still there, and past dependence will remain. So the Russians will not leave the region for the foreseeable future. The EU and the market changes, especially on the gas market and the electricity market, has shifted the concept of energy security in the region. This was a large success in terms of acceptability, in order that today the contractual mechanisms are much more flexible on the gas market in the region. We have access to hubs, and in the classical terms, if you see what kind of problems we had 10 years ago, supply cuts or whatever, it's not a real problem anymore. So this is why we are rather relaxed, and this is why Russian energy dependence, in this classical sense, is much less an issue today than, let me say, 10 years ago. So, for example, Hungarian gas imports fell by 50% in the last 10 years. So I don't think that Russian gas dependence is a major problem at the moment in Hungary. So, well, we are more tolerant. At the same time, affordability issues still remain there. So the region is not ready to pay a premium for non-Russian energy resources. Affordability is still a major issue for many of the countries. There are some exceptions in the Baltic states, but Hungary definitely does not belong to this group. And the Russians always undercut any kind of alternative projects. So it is important for the Hungarian government to have some sort of alternative project on the line, but they are not ready to pay for it. This is just an instrument in order to put pressure on the Russians, whether it's a Croatian LNG or Italian LNG or, I don't know, Visegrad cooperation. But it is important in order to have a bargaining chip against the Russian. And of course, there is this rentierism story that on the one side, of course, corruption is still a problem in the region. Populistic utilization of energy prices is still there. And on the other side, Russia is ready to use energy as a bargaining chip. So the political elites are not really keen to get rid of this kind of practice. And this is still there. So, well, if we compare what we had 15 years ago, we had a strong market power from the Gazprom, from the Rosatom, on the region and in Hungary, and there was a government ready to invest into energy security. What is the situation today? That this kind of market power has weakened, definitely, but local governments are not that much keen to do anything more what has been done. So the willingness is very different, and this is, I think, in many senses, a much more difficult problem. Why it is so? Well, I don't think that in energy, Hungarian government opted for the Russians. They opted for a certain sectoral market model. And in this regard, the Hungarian energy sector today is fundamentally different from its past form 10 years ago. 10 years ago, we had, well, I wouldn't say a very much competitive, but a fairly competitive regional market with traders, foreign multinationals in the company. Well, we had administrative pricing, but administrative pricing of gas, electricity was rather in line with the profitability. Today, what we have is national champions, state-owned national champions. The foreign multinationals are ousted. We had deep and very populistic utility rate cuts, and this was the single element in the 2014 electoral campaign, which helped Viktor Orban to double his two-thirds majority and win the elections. We have a very centralized decision-making, so fundamentally the market is repoliticized. So what we have is a major retreat to something what we had, looks like in the 70s, in the energy market. So, well, in this sense, of course, it brings a lot of conflict with the EU, and we have major problems in sustaining this kind of mechanism in the market. So this is a centrally organized, sometimes rather politicized market. And of course, the Russians show a good deal of tolerance in this regard. So they are ready to give a price discount in the time of an electoral campaign. They are ready to finance particular business groups through the gas price discounts. Of course, they are ready to cooperate with national champions in order to make it impossible the entry for other players to contract all the companies. And of course, in the nuclear industry, they are ready to renew the nuclear capacities. And this would be impossible, I think, with any other Western companies. So what is the situation? That this is not only the government who is interested in maintaining the Russian dependence, but those economic actors and corporate actors which were created during this process. Nuclear industry is understandably interested in maintaining the Russian contract for the renewal of the nuclear capabilities. This means this is a contract value of 10% of the Hungarian GDP. Well, the gas national champion is definitely interested in keeping the long-term market contracts with the Russians, because any alternative, any liberalization of the gas market would lose to a decreasing market share in its portfolio. And this is the same in the electricity industry. So, well, I think that the situation is rather complex in this regard, and the systematic change in the Hungarian energy market, which led to an increasing Russian leverage on the market. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to Romania. My colleague Otilia is going to introduce to you the chapter that was prepared for Romania.
Oh. Oh, it's okay. No.
Technology is always a challenge.
We'll try it again.
Oh my gosh.
Well, I can speak also without a PowerPoint presentation. Because
But the title was quite interesting,
Yeah.
so it would be a pity not to see it.
Okay.
Thank
You very much. So yes, this is how we entitled our country chapter on Romania. No need for the Russians. Romanians misgovern themselves. And we have some reasons for this assertion. And in recent years, indeed, there has been, let's say, a wave of insidious influence from the Russians, but this hasn't affected very much the energy sector, and there are some reasons for that. So before 1989, during communist time, we had our dictator was focused on developing energy independence, getting very independent from the Russians, and our energy sector looks pretty much, self-reliant and focusing on local resources and so on. So we tried very hard to develop our industry and develop our local resources. And this has led to a path dependence that we see even today in the energy sector. Right now, the only thing that we import from Russia directly or from Russian companies is gas. And in recent times, following also the decrease, like in Hungary, of the consumption, we are almost to zero in 2015. The market is pretty competitive, but this is not exactly our own merit. It's mostly because there has been a strong push from the European Union to develop a competitive market, to develop institutions, to make a liquid energy market both for electricity and gas. There is also a very strong anti-Russian public mood, which means that a politician couldn't go very openly in the public and say that he supports some Russian project. And this is why we didn't see in any of the past years, an open support for projects like South Stream or Turkish Stream now. However, this doesn't mean that we don't have similar patterns with Hungary and other countries in the region, non-EU states, of having poor governance, companies which have special relationships with the state, and so on. And in our case, we haven't seen Russian investors coming, like in Hungary, to build nuclear power plants, or like in Bulgaria, but we've seen Chinese investors which do pretty much the same thing. And the problem that we have with that is exactly the same. The fact that they are contracted non-competitively, that we don't know exactly what's in those contracts, how much state aid is involved in that. We also had in the recent past some very dubious energy deals in which most of the electricity sector was state-owned companies, which are in fact competing with each other somehow. But they were also giving very cheap electricity at well below market prices to some preferred partners. So we had our bad governance, which was unconnected with foreign influence per se. Okay, how do you? Is it blocked or? Okay. Yeah. So these were the main issues. What we could call in European terms illegal state aid, because companies which get cheap energy from a state-owned company, it's practically as if you're getting a subsidy. We have non-transparency in procurement and non-competitive procurement. Indirectly, however, these vested interests have supported Russian interests as well, but only indirectly. And we had a particular case in the gas sector in which one individual, who was also the richest oligarch in Romania, had a fertilizer company, and he received gas at very low prices. He actually, in order to get those contracts for gas, he was consuming 20% of the total consumption of the country, or this is equivalent to the all the household consumption. And in order to get those contracts, he actually forced the market to remain regulated. He was very influential with the government, and he was pushing against opening the market and against opening the gas sector of Romania towards exports. This, of course, would have been also a clash with Russian interests, because Romania would have been probably the only country in the region which could have become an exporter of gas. Of course, in terms of the whole EU market, it doesn't mean much, but for countries like Moldova or Bulgaria or even Hungary, the quantities of gas that we might have exported could have been a serious competition. But this was, again, it was only for the benefits of a local player, who then went to jail, and then the market was liberalized in the end. So indirectly, there were two benefits for Russia. One is the fact that they didn't have competition for exported gas from Romania, and the other was the fact that the market was regulated in a certain way in which they got a much higher benefit than if they were a monopoly. If you are a monopoly, you have to take care of how much you increase the price, because otherwise the demand will decrease. The way in which the Romanian market was regulated was that the Russians could have increased the gas prices as much as possible. Romanian regulator would have responded with decreasing the price for domestic gas in order to keep the gas price constant. However, even though so far there isn't any direct involvement of the Russians, it doesn't mean that it has to be so in the future. So the main challenge for Romania is to become now, also with the support of the EU, an exporter of gas in the region. The source of gas that might be exported is in the Black Sea. Those reserves are in the economic territory of Romania, but they are not in the national territory, or how it's called. Exclusive, yeah. So that means that, for example, if those deposits get connected to the grid and can be exported, of course it will take a lot of money to do deep drilling offshore, and investors, which are actually companies like Exxon, they might be discouraged if, for example, Russians start doing some naval drills in the region. So, yeah, I would stop here, and then I'll ask for questions.
Thank you very much, Otilia. So these are the two chapter presentations, and we also have two discussants with us. One is from our partner SIPA, Corina Rebeja. Please, Corina.
Thank you very much. So I'm very happy to be here, so thank you to Ned for hosting this and for supporting the project, and thank you to our partners for putting together such a great report, which I've had the pleasure to read 2.5 times already. And I would start by saying that we also at SIPA, we've been doing some work on this issue of democratic backsliding in Central and Eastern Europe, and this is very worrisome. And we've also looked at how the Russians have been very keen in supporting this democratic backsliding. And I think what the report does very well is showing how Russia's strategy is playing out in Central and Eastern Europe, in particular when it comes to speculating the existing vulnerabilities of countries in the region, and then in particular by tapping into some favorable political contexts. So when it comes to energy policy, I think what we are seeing in the report presented today is that there are two mutually reinforcing tracks of Russian policy and the Russian approach, the economic and the political one. Now, we in, let's say in the West, in the European Union and the US, we see these two as being separate. The government merely creates, let's say, the environment, rule-based environment in which these companies operate. For the Kremlin, companies and the commercial aspect is a mere political tool to advance its goals in the region. And I think the first problem in how we approach Russia and the developments in Central and Eastern Europe comes from this difference of perception. Secondly, something that's comes out very clearly in the report, specifically when it comes to the two case studies of Romania and Hungary, is again the continuum between good governance considerations and national security considerations. And I think for a long time we haven't been used to put the two together in the same type of thinking, and we've always separated good governance from national security consideration and vice versa, and I think we might be at a time when we need to go back to that. And then, of course, while the Kremlin has a rather well-known toolbox, I think what the case studies reveal is the extent to which it has become able at exploiting the national specificities and produce very tailor-made interventions. I think for all of the countries you'll see in the report, other than Moldova and Ukraine, there are no two countries that are the same. And I would say Belarus is an outlier, let's say, in the EU neighborhood area, and then Romania is sort of an outlier in the EU's eastern flank. But I think this offers really great insights into domestic political dynamics, and the vulnerabilities that offer the Kremlin the opportunity to penetrate and use the system from within, and then take advantage of the inherent governance weaknesses, as we've seen in the case of Romania. And since the question of the day is not today, but sort of the conversation in the West when we think about Russia is what is Russia's strategy in Central and Eastern Europe, I think one element that it's worth looking at is how Russia is using competition or stimulating sometimes non-existing competition between Central and Eastern European countries, and promotes projects like South Stream, like Turkish Stream now, even Nord Stream, to sow disunity and cultivate distrust between neighbors, Romania, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, or Central and Eastern Europe and Western Europe, if we think about Nord Stream. And then, they're paving the way to these mega deals with very small concessions that appeal to local politicians mainly, and sometimes even to local constituencies. Now, what is interesting in the two EU countries presented here is the different patterns of intervention and the different pattern of reception, if you will. Now, in the case of Hungary, I think Andras really does a great job in presenting the Kremlin's ability to maximize the domestic political context in order to get smooth access to the market. And of course, that's not unique to Hungary, but this makes it very troublesome because it is doing that right on EU territory and sort of playing against EU rules and principles. And it's also troublesome because, and this goes back to something that Sorin was saying at the beginning about the confrontation of the two models that is back to the forefront, is that I think Andras calls it the Russian model. And that's what makes domestic politicians interested in promoting more Russian investment or more Russian influence in their countries, is that in this way they can ensure that they can maintain control over strategic assets or strategic industries, so then that they can manipulate prices or give sweetheart deals to their political cronies, and so they would get benefits in their own political battles at home. And I think that might be one of the keys in which we can or need to read this report, in particular when it comes to EU states, that there is a seductive alternative, as it appears, from Hungary, but also from Romania, but in a different way, and that the EU maybe has not been able to fully insulate its governance model from this type of erosion. And this takes me to the Romanian case, because as I said, it seems to be an outlier for all of the reasons that Otilia mentioned, but also the political and governance vulnerabilities at home can make it a very propitious target for Russian influence. Now, in 2015, SIPA ran a working group on energy security focusing on Romania. And one of the things we looked at was this false sense of security that Romania had at the time. Otilia mentioned almost zero dependency on gas exports, which also led to a lack of foresight in terms of future challenges and vulnerabilities. And I think Romania is kind of used to think of it in this way. And the two of the big advantages of Romania are that it can be a really short and safe pathway for gas transport, although not everybody sees that, but Romanians like to see that. And then it has the very promising offshore resources, which can turn it into a gas export. And I think your study does a great job in showing that. This is where we might see more of Russian interference if Kremlin begins to see Romania as a potential source of competition for gas exports in the region. Of course, if we manage to build and finalize all of the interconnectors and actually start the reverse flow to Hungary and Bulgaria and so on. But we might see Russian behavior that will try to preempt Romania from becoming an energy exporter. So just to end my remarks, I think the key issues that the report is raising more on a regional scale and EU scale is a question of whether the EU has had the ability to be a game changer in the energy sector. And maybe the experts will address this question later with regard to the third energy package. And how much has the EU changed the spectrum of and opportunities for Russian influence? I mean, we have been used to believe that it has tremendously, and I do believe that. But somehow things begin to reverse, and we've seen that a lot, not just in energy, but also in information space and in defense and so on. And also related to that, what is missing from the current architecture? Are our goals, and when I say our, I mean the West, EU, US, solidarity, coordination, and diversification when it comes to energy being effectively pursued? And if you look at the derogation from sanctions, for instance, that many Western energy companies are getting, I think that's a valid question to ask. And not least, how do we strike the right balance between national security considerations and our economic and commercial policy, including energy? Now, I think in the second panel we will get some answers to that from Ukraine, where I know there's been some movement in that direction. But we might have to consider some things like banning companies that are more than 60% state-owned, so that the likes of Rosatom or Gazprom are no longer, because they're not necessarily commercial actors in the way we're used to. Or we might just have to bear the cost of strategic projects like Lithuania did with the LNG terminal when the government covered and there was no private participation in there. And I think because we are in Washington, these are also the areas or the questions that the US should get more involved in answering together with the EU and help or support the EU, work together with the EU to enforce the policies, implement some of the existing projects, in particular when it comes to big infrastructure projects and interconnectors, and just act more as a broker, appeal more to the sense of unity and solidarity that sometimes seems to be missing in Central and Eastern Europe and the EU in general. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Corina, for your deep analysis. And indeed, I think you've heard a lot about EU rules and how they work. The question is, how adherent are we to these rules? Are they ours, or are they externally imposed on us and perceived by the populations of this country as external factors, really, rather than internal things that have value added for the population? I think we'll have some comments from our discussants and authors on this point. I'll move to our last discussant, Ms. Asenova, please.
Thank you. A year ago, Janusz Bugajski and I published a book called Eurasian Disunion, Russia's Vulnerable Flanks. It's kind of a big read, about 500 pages, but it looks into all the regions that are surrounding the Russian Federation, starting from Northern Europe, going to Central Europe, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, South Caucasus, and Central Asia, and looking into Russian strategy and Russian tactics. The purpose of this study was to expose what Russia is aiming for, and we came to the conclusion that, as many after that, or before that have come to as well, that Russia is striving to be a polar of power or center of power in a multipolar and a multi-center world. It's no longer the one leading force, the superpower of the United States. Russia is challenging this. It reverts to a 19th century vision of great powers deciding everything. There are several centers of great powers in the world, and there are little states that should be within the Russian orbit. And those states that should be within the Russian orbit are unfortunately all the states in Central and Eastern Europe, those that were under communism before, under Soviet domination before, and now Russia still considers them as part of its zone of influence, sphere of influence, or part of its neo-imperial ambition. And we need to start here to see what Russia is doing in every single sector of economy, diplomacy, information, in media, in ethnic minorities, in every single aspect that Russia is using. This is the strategy. This is the goal. This is the goal that Putin believes he is the Messiah who needs to bring Russia back to glory, and everything else in foreign policy is subordinate to this goal. When we come to tactics, things are a lot more flexible. They are not as rigid as the main goal, the strategy. They are used in different countries in different ways. Energy is one part of the economic tools. But the tools and the groups of tools are actually 8, we counted them. They are international, informational, ideological, economic, ethnic, political, social, and military. When you look at these 8 categories, and under the subcategories of each of them, we have counted about 68 tools we call the Russian arsenal of subversion. It's not simply a playbook, it's a whole arsenal. And it's used selectively in each country depending on what openings Russia is going to find. In terms of energy, there are alliances that are built in different countries with companies that start to play the role of a Russian proxies or energy lobby. These lobbies are used to buy politicians. And when we talk about countries in Eastern Europe are corrupt or underdeveloped or not finished the transition, we have to also say that Russia is either exploiting the corruption or insensitizing the corruption or promoting corruption in these countries. To a large extent, the biggest corruption deals in most of our countries are related to energy and particularly to Russian energy interests. Is that by chance? No, it's not. The banking sector is also subject to penetration. The communication sector is also subject to penetration. The tourism sector as well. The real estate. So there are so many tools that Russia is using, but this report, and I congratulate all of you for writing this report, because the value of this report is exposing in great detail the exact tools that are used in Central Eastern Europe in these 5 countries, and also their comparisons with other countries in the region too, to disclose, to discover, to expose this very dangerous picture that we have in Central and Eastern Europe. And here comes, as Corina mentioned, the need for the United States to be paying attention to this region, because it is a frontline region. All of these countries are part of the frontline zone that has formed particularly after Crimea, that are subject to particular penetration and particular danger from all these 8 categories that I mentioned. In terms of Romania and Hungary, such a different history of the energy sectors, it's almost unbelievable that we can even compare them. But Romania is a producer of energy. It has natural resources. Hungary doesn't. Romania has a nuclear power plant built with Candu reactors, Canadian technology, produces its own nuclear fuel, stores it itself, doesn't need to have Russia in the horizon to do that for it. Hungary, the opposite. Rosatom is going to build the nuclear power plants, it's going to provide the fuel, it's going to secure the storage, and it's going to be exactly the picture that Bulgaria had for many years, completely dependent on the will and the wish of Kremlin. If they decide to raise the price for storage of nuclear waste, then the country has no other option but pay high for that service. The gas dependence, although it's reduced already in Hungary, it's almost zero in Romania. Romania has started producing its own gas, and probably is going to start supplying other countries. And Corina is absolutely right. Here is something to watch. At the moment, Romania starts exporting gas to Bulgaria, for example, or to Western Balkans. This is going to be the time where the sleeping network that has been built by Russian different interests on the ground is going to be activated. And this is something that the government should be prepared, the civil society should be prepared, the business community should be prepared. We need to stay one step ahead of all that, at least one step ahead of all that. Because as Russia is declining as a state, by all kinds of metrics, demographic, economic, you name it, Russia is going to become more aggressive internationally, because it's very important for Putin, for Kremlin, to maintain this dominance over the region in order to gather support internally at home. Hungary has gotten to that position by its own will. It was the decision of the government, and I don't buy this about market considerations when it comes to energy. Because Romania was the main supporter of Nabucco pipeline, when Hungary, Bulgaria, Serbia were the main supporters of South Stream pipeline, as if the governments couldn't see what the difference was, and in what trap the South Stream was going to bring them all, including Austria as well. But South Stream was always a political project. All the governments believed it was going to happen, but the purpose of South Stream wasn't the pipeline. It was the process in which the new members of the European Union were getting divided from Brussels. They were getting divided among themselves. They couldn't come to any kind of joint strategy to push back on Russian dependence, on Russian intervention and penetration. They were incapacitated this way. So eventually the project fell through because the European rules cannot be violated the way Russia wanted to do it. And now Russia is using the European rules to request third-party access to TAP, the Trans-Adriatic pipeline that is still in the process of being built from Turkish border to Greece to Italy. Because the European rules allow for reserve capacity for third-party suppliers. So once they are against the rules and they want the European Union to change the rules for Gazprom, then they insist to use European rules to get access to pipelines that are not theirs. And then in the Bulgaria case, for example, Overgas, which is owned by Gazprom, sued the state, the government of Bulgaria, for not giving them access to the pipeline that comes from Russia delivering Russian gas. Again, using the EU rule against other countries. I'll finish here because we need to have time for questions, but I want to throw one thing that is current now. It's very important to be watched and for all these countries in the region to react. Gazprom is about to settle with the European Commission on anti-monopoly probe. And that probe doesn't envision any kind of compensation paid to countries that were paying exorbitant prices for Russian gas. Just to give you one example, at some point Bulgaria was paying $600 per 1,000 BCM, 1,000 cubic meters. Macedonia was paying even higher prices. Hungary was paying higher prices. All these, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, they were paying much higher prices. None of these countries is going to be compensated under the draft settlement with the European Commission. And it doesn't seem to be much of a support among other countries in Europe for that to happen. Unless Gazprom is punished, Russia is punished for what it did to its neighbors, making them pay such prices and restrictive contracts not to be able to export gas to third countries and so on. There's not going to be future behavior that would be any different. It will be just a temporary solution, and after a while we're going to see another modification of Russian behavior in the energy sector.
All right. I want to thank everyone who has stayed with us through the short break as we fill out the remainder of our panel. For those of you who may or may not know, my name is Peter Duran. I am the Executive Vice President of CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis. CEPA is the only U.S.-based think tank dedicated exclusively to the countries of Berlin and Moscow, between Berlin and Moscow, so Central and Eastern Europe. Before we get started, though, it goes without saying that we absolutely have to thank just two specific groups, NED, for their support and adding visibility to this discussion, as well as our partners and, dare I say, friends from Romania and elsewhere at the Expert Forum. Our topic today, as we already know, is energy, Russian influence, and democratic backsliding in Central and Eastern Europe. So we have three topics, one region, and as we saw from our first panel, a lot of questions. Now, in our first panel, if we broke it down into looking at the West versus East, and West being the demarcation line between the European Union and Russia's neighbors, we heard about a clash of governance systems, we heard about unfinished business since 1989, and we heard about techniques for divide and rule. While I was listening to the conversation, it struck me that three common themes emerged from that first panel. First, that the stakes are high, dependency on Russian energy is dangerous, and the risk of democratic backsliding is real. For our second panel, we're going to shift the lens slightly east. Now, covering Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine. It goes without saying that these are Western countries. They deserve to be part of the West, and they, by all rights, are Western. But when we look at these dividing lines, too often, whether or not we're talking NATO or EU membership, energy markets, or reform, they tend to be east of the East-West dividing line. For our panel, I believe there is one organizing question. And it is a provocative one. And I will pose this to each one of our panelists, and through our comments, I wonder if we could return to this question. Why should we care about the East? Because here in Washington, and we heard this from questions from the audience earlier, Russia's neighbors may seem a long way away, the EU may seem closer, and the market and country risk in the energy field can be daunting. Often it is said, and I think it is an excellent point, that from a Washington perspective, where we're having this conversation, our values and interests align with Central and Eastern European countries on the question of energy. Clean markets, transparent markets, and diverse markets make for free markets and assist free societies. These are the goals of decades of US and European policy. The alternatives are bad for Russia's neighbors, bad for our shared values and interests, good for Moscow, and could encourage backsliding. So if the Russian government, which owns the upstream on energy, does not want democracy to succeed in the East, it is because success of democratic governance is a refutation of its authoritarian narrative, that authoritarianism is the future. This is the context for our conversation today, and I think for us, what I'm really looking to hear from the panelists is the answer to how. How do we protect our gains, fuel our economies, and harness good governance to benefit Central and Eastern European societies? We have, as you can see, a very full panel. We will keep to a, I would say, Teutonic schedule and make sure we wrap up on time. By way of introductions, and I would ask each one of our panelists to keep your comments to 5 minutes. I will then ask you a question as a follow-up. You can think about it as the other panelists give their presentations. We will have a discussion here on the panel, and we'll open it up for Q&A. In the order of the agenda, our introductions are as follows. We're joined today by Denise Nazarenko of the Dixie Group from Ukraine, Alexei Pekulik, who I've known for several years now from the Belarusian Institute for Strategic Studies, Denise Chenusha from Expert Group Moldova, Sorin Ionitsa from Expert Group Romania, and of course Ilya Zaslavsky from Chatham House. I will go in the order of the agenda. Denise, the floor is yours, and I wish you could talk a bit about how we achieve these three questions of protecting our gains while fueling our economies and harnessing good governance to do so.
We're going to the...
I'm sorry?
I will present it from here, because we have the slides.
Okay, please.
Mm-hmm. Or probably not. Yes, it's locked. Okay, I can see this. So I need my... Good afternoon. Thank you very much for hosting us here. It is my great honor and pleasure to present Ukraine in this project. I will do my best to be within the time schedule, meaning I will just go straight to the presentation. And wow. Sorry. So, very briefly, which topics did our team cover in this presentation? Is obviously the ownership acquisition by the Russian capital, then the holy grail in the Russian-Ukrainian energy relations is the gas transportation system. Then we'll go to the pipeline politics, and the technological dependence would be covered, followed by the hybrid war in energy. So very briefly, in ownership acquisition, we researched how open, systematic, and purposed it was, contrary to what will be covered by, actually what was covered in the first panel, and most of all it is due to the absence of strict European legal framework. We discovered that all those acquisitions could not be called investment in full sense of this word, because many factors, and that's why it should be regarded as the penetration. Then we discovered that current concentration of the Russian capital is mostly is within the retail or downstream energy, and the implication of that, underlined by the non-transparent, non-market-based energy sector in Ukraine, is the fantastic margins and very close proximity of the Russian capital with the Ukrainian policymakers and politicians. In gas transportation system, which is probably the most interesting part, we defined the strong positions of Ukrainian government, surprisingly, in defending the legal status of gas transportation system and preventing it from being acquired by the Kremlin the way it was in Belarus, which we'll be following. And in addition to the legislation that was the main factor for the Ukrainian gas transportation system being right now under full Ukrainian control, it is important to mention that the Kremlin failed by this legislation in the first place to acquire the direct control over the system, started to attempt to impose some corruption schemes in the Ukrainian energy sector, starting with the buying the politician and becoming the basically monopolistic supplier, effectively expelling all other possible gas suppliers in Ukraine, meaning the Middle East and Middle East countries in the first place. The other ways for Kremlin to do after no effect was in acquisition of the GTS was to discredit the system in the first place, and this is actually what we are talking about during the last year and maybe even more in terms of Nord Stream 2 project and many other projects that in the first place are pursuing the goal of substituting the Ukrainian gas transit capacities. And the gas wars or gas conflicts and threats to the EU in terms of not supplying gas in the critical winter months through Ukrainian GTS was the obvious tools of the Kremlin management to pursuing this goal of discredit Ukrainian GTS, and by doing this, lowering the price and its inherent value, which led in part to the Kharkiv Accords, which is a remarkable example of how little value paid the Kremlin to the energy negotiations and energy deals, because in doing this set of packages, basically Moscow has bought the Sevastopol as the Chernomorsk fleet base in the Crimea for misleading discounts in the gas price, which eventually turned out to be let's say not a discount, but surplus to the price. And now we are here in the situation when lots and lots of attention is paid to the the future of the Ukrainian GTS, and especially in terms of the alternative projects, just like Nord Stream 2. Seeing the end of the transit contract in just 2 years, there is a serious trade and bargaining of how important Ukrainian GTS in fact is and what's the future it has. Such projects like Nord Stream 2, there is a lot of issues, of course, and I guess this it's not the time to explain this in details, but mostly it is they lie in the legal aspects. It's insignificant right now. What's the important part of this point of the research is the setting is still quite favorable because of the new management in the Naftogaz and quite efficient work of the Anti-Monopoly Committee of Ukraine that conducted an investigation against Gazprom, which eventually led to a record skyrocketing fine towards Gazprom for exploiting its monopolistic position in Ukrainian gas sector, as well as the external factors, just like the Polish legal move against Gazprom in terms of Opal gas pipeline. And of course, the approximation of Ukrainian legislation to the EU energy laws, which is not that fast and efficient that we would like to see it, but still lots of Ukrainian problems have been solved by just switching to the norms and regulations of the single European energy market. Especially in terms of gas, as you probably know, Ukraine is not contracting Russian gas directly for more than a year and a half, instead buying gas in the EU countries, which basically meaning that we're still using Russian gas, but we have no direct contracts with Gazprom anymore. In part of technological dependence, we explored two different areas, being the nuclear energy and power grid synchronization with the Russian system. And it is very important, as much as nuclear energy is responsible for more than 60% of national power generation. And it turned out that in this industry, we severely depend on Russian fuel and Russian services on disposal of the spent nuclear fuel, as well as the technology itself. We explored how in different tender procedures Ukrainian government has favored Rosatom and not paying due regard to Westinghouse company, in spite of so many factors like better prices, more stability in operation, and especially the desire of the Rosatom to remain and reserve the proprietary rights towards the technology and just to lease it to Ukraine, which was not the case with the Westinghouse. But anyways, we are here right now, and we still depend heavily on Rosatom fuel. But within the last year and a half, considerable progress has been made, and now more and more fuel is coming from Westinghouse. And the last point is the hybrid war. We examined how the population of the eastern regions of Ukraine, especially those coal miners, fell victims to the Russian propaganda and basically become the proxies of the Russian armed forces within the territory of Ukraine, and basically If you remember, I just told you that there is 60% of power generation coming from nuclear energy, and the heat power plants are responsible for almost all the rest of the power generation, being in half supplied by the anthracite coal, which is only produced by those territories that are not under the governmental control right now, meaning a full bunch of problems for the Ukrainian energy system, which is officially in the emergency state for more than half year by now. And the anthracite coal is not the only problem. The issue of the shale gas investment made by the American companies has been covered by the first panel, and I will not go in that way as well. And well, the biggest problem in this part of the research was the informational war or informational conflict waging by Russia against Ukrainian population, mainly focusing on trying to to divide the population and to exploit the myths created by the Russian propaganda in the first place about the attitudes towards the coal miners being the most economic active population on these territories. But in terms of recommendations, we divided our recommendations in two parts, and those are just for the American audience. In public sector, we came out with the underline that reforms in line with the European energy legislation is the single most important factor of stability in Ukrainian energy and economy as such, and the implementation of OECD principles in governing the state-owned companies, which is the main economic power in the energy sector, unfortunately, is very important. Then the collaboration and cooperation between the FBI and other American anti-corruption and law enforcement agencies has shown a great effect for the newly created Ukrainian anti-corruption bodies such as National Anti-Corruption Bureau and Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecution Office. And we also touched a little bit the United States Foreign Corruption Practices Act as one of the direct link between United States administration and Ukrainian energy sector, which is illustrated by the case of Mr. Firtash being prosecuted directly on the basis of this act. Well, the capacity of Ukrainian governmental and non-governmental actors is critically low, which has been a major factor in the success that Russian governments and non-government actors have been playing in Ukraine, and that is very why the investment in the capacity building is very important in Ukraine right now. I know that United States is doing really great job in this regard, as well as European Commission, and this work that brings a lot of fruits, and it must be continued in the most extent possible. Well, and the last slide, it regards to the public and private recommendations. The extended LNG supplies to Europe is already a fact for the American energy sector, but growing it in number and volumes would benefit the whole region, as well as, I'm not talking about Central and East Europe only, but the whole single European market would benefit from more American gas coming through LNG. And especially in the nuclear sector, the tech transfer and direct trade, especially in terms of technology, not just fuels, would benefit both sides as we see it, and Ukraine in terms of stability and diversification of supplies, and those American companies that would contract Energoatom as Ukrainian operator of nuclear power stations. With this, I would leave the floor for the next presentations, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Denise. So, Denise, if I understand your presentation correctly, you make the case that he who owns the energy, or at least the energy infrastructure in Ukraine, has an opportunity to shape policy, either for good or ill, that energy monopolies in Ukraine are bad for democracy. As we look to other panelists, I will leave you with this question. I hope we can come back to it in a follow-up, and it's a simple one. Ultimately, what would you say success in Ukraine looks like? Is it enough that we break the chain between energy and corruption in Ukraine? So what does true success for Ukraine's energy stability look like in the future? Ponder that. We'll move next to Alexei Pikulik to look a little bit north to Belarus. Join me in welcoming Alexei to the podium.
Speaking of the link between corruption and energy, I was on a flight with Yulia Tymoshenko yesterday, and we had a nice chat while waiting for the passport control. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it here. It would be fantastic. Thank you very much. My name is Alexei Pikulik, and I will try to be brief on talking about Belarusian case, which is, why it doesn't, it shows here, it doesn't show here. What should I do you know? Wait a minute. I have to wait. Okay. Nothing happens. Should I press something, or here it's perfect? It's the way it should be. Connect to a projector. Oh. We shouldn't joke about the Russian hackers, no. Okay, so the title of this presentation is F5, I think. Doesn't matter, okay. It's called Anesthesia Belarus, how Belarus turned energy dependency into economic advantage. And here within this 5 slides, which I promised to be brief, I'll try to explain and show how deep energy dependency on Russia became the key building block of the Belarusian socio-economic model, political stability, and how this anesthesia, which Belarus sheerly received from the Russian budget, helped the country to stall its transition, and how it contributed to the reversal of the democracy and market economy already in 95-96. So the argument is quite simple. Belarus political autocracy and socialist mixed economy could be best explained through the prism of a rentier state, and Belarus was one of the first which started to exploit this rentier state model initially crafted by Hussein Mahdavi in his 1970s texts, speaking about those states which rather live off the external aid, external grants, rather than the surplus production of its own population. Second, Lukashenko created a socially inclusive autocracy, having one major know-how, relying on the extraction of the external rents from Russia. 3, rents came in the form of gas, oil, administratively stimulated access to Russian market, and the creation of asymmetrical integrational institutions in which Belarus would be the net winner, while Russia would be the loser when it comes to splitting the profits. So here in this presentation, I will only focus on, I believe, two major areas. One is gas and one is oil. Another argument is that what matters for Belarusian status, for the Belarusian deadlock, and by this I mean that Belarus has been deadlocked in a situation of a socialist mixed economy, where you have around 70% of your GDP produced in the public sector. Belarus has been consolidated autocracy since '96, so basically in this shape it survived for 20 years. And here to cite Leszek Balcerowicz, socialism is a great thing as long as there is somebody willing to pay for it. In case of Belarus, this is Russia, and what matters for Belarusian stability and for basically the incumbent survival is the share of rents to the GDP. This is one, and I will show with some figures that in certain years it was up to a quarter of Belarusian GDP, which it extracted externally. Second, it's the cost of the external rent seeking. Basically, when you rely on extracting rents, windfall profits from Russia, and you have to give something in exchange, what matters is the strength of your nationalists who might be against and who might see potential military and political threats in the dealings that you make. Three, what matters for Belarus is the ownership of rents. Who owns those netfall profits? Is it Yulia Tymoshenko after the reform of the Ukrainian gas trading system, where the private gas traders receive the access to selling gas? Or this is the centralized state which tries to act in the name of social welfare and which redistributes wealth by expanding the public sector and behaves exactly like the rentier states do. And the final one is what matters is how those external rents are being distributed. And as I argue, Belarus has been the socially inclusive rentier state. In a way, President Lukashenko preferred to be popular much more than he preferred to be rich. So in a way, the external rents and the windfall profits were generously spent on buying of popular support and buying of loyalty. Now a few figures to demonstrate the argument. Oil-based trends in Belarus between 2001 and 2012. What you need to understand here from this figure, how it functions. Belarus has a capacity to refine 24 million tons of oil per year, which the oil refineries were built within the Soviet military system, trying to equip the potential Soviet tanks as close to the western border as possible. So this was the big Soviet legacy, quite modern refineries, and what did Belarus, which has no deposits of its own oil, or has some, basically, the capacity of 1.5 million tons, which is nothing, which is 4 times less than the internal need of the republic. Basically, what you need to build a petro state in Belarus is to make sure that there is somebody who is willing to give you oil for the domestic Russian prices, which are below the market. You refine this oil products and basically you sell petrochemicals westwards at a higher premium on a normal price. So basically, if you look at those figures, you will see that between 2001 and 2012, the oil rents to the GDP was between 5.7 in 2001 up to 13.7% of the GDP. This is how much Belarus earned just from buying crudes, refining crudes, and selling crudes to the major companies from Glencore, Vitol, and the other major oil-based companies. So this is quite simple, and I don't want to pay too much attention to this. This is the solvent schema, which I don't have time to explain here, and it's boring. Gas-based rents, basically the solvent schema shows certain creativity of the Belarusian leadership, in which at some point they decided to demonstrate the exported goods, not as petrochemicals, not as diesel, not as gasoline, but as solvents, some sort of a new chemical substance which is used. If you take the cistern of diesel, you put certain organic additives which do not change the functionality of your diesel, but which change the chemical structure. You can claim that this is not what you see, and this is made to clean certain surfaces, so you don't have to return back the tariffs which you are supposed to return to the Russian budget. So this is another way of making $3-4 billion per year to supply the state budget. If you look at the gas-based trends, basically, if you have such a huge energy-intensive production as you have in Belarus, what you need to make sure to become competitive, you have to keep the prices low, and to keep the prices low, you have to make sure that the gas which you receive is below the market price, making your goods competitive. Added to this would be your administratively stimulated demand for the Belarusian goods on the Russian market, since we have a union state which is not functional but which is signed. Your goods should not or do not compete with the Chinese goods on the Russian market, so you don't have to participate in all those boring procedures of public procurement and tenders. You are having the privilege of having local goods. So between 2006 and 2012, this figure was as high as 12.5% and at a certain point as low as 9.6%. So if you add them together, this would be about 24-25% of the GDP in certain years, which quite shows, and here I didn't even say a word about additional sources of income for the Belarusian budget coming from loopholes in the border, smuggling, opportunities for trade. Basically, in the situation when you don't have any customs border between Belarus and between Russia, but you have two external customs borders, you can manipulate the prices quite well. 3 conclusions, and I conclude. So Western policy towards Belarus should consider the nature of its energy dependency. For Ukraine, for Moldova, for many other countries, energy dependency on Russia is a threat. For Belarus, energy dependency is a drug blessing and anesthesia, which allowed the insolvent economy to fly. Of course, I'm exaggerating, which allowed the insolvent economy to fly and to survive. Second of all, Belarus is not a typical post-Soviet autocracy that could be combated with sanctions and demonstration effect, but a rather popular rentier state model in which the society more or less understands the essence of the success of this model, but basically more or less people are happy in trading the political rights for certain economic benefits. And 3, Lukashenko losing grants from Russia, which is the case for the last 2-3 years, opens up further windows of engagement and change via EU and US. It doesn't say the word US because this was just made for Brussels. EU and US growing leverage and linkage. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Do you have PowerPoint as well? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to ask Alexei a question, and if you want to set up here. So Alexei, if I followed you correctly, a few big themes emerged from your presentation. The first is that the ultimate organizing problem with a rent-seeking state is that it creates rent seekers who don't want the system to change because it's empowering them. In Belarus, there is a quid pro quo relationship with Russia. This is well known, this for that. But the problem is what one must give in order to get. As you're talking, the question in my mind, and I would ask you to ponder this and we'll come back to it, is ultimately then, is there any scenario in which Belarus could ultimately be free of Russian dependence, energy dependence, and how do we in the West, what role is it for us to help create that scenario? So it's an easy question, if you will. Yeah, okay. So think about that. We'll come back to you on that. Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm ready. So, actually, answering to your question, why East matters, I think that the energy dependence on Russia, it's a big issue related to actually security. So dependence of Moldova, for example, is very much linked to what is going on in the breakaway region, in Transnistrian region, and at the same time it has social implications and economic implications for the development of the entire country. And in my presentation, I will actually underscore this. So I'm very, very glad to be able to present Moldovan case in Washington. So far, you have heard about Moldova lately with regard to banking sector and the devaluation of about $1 billion. So actually, energy sector is the second one which can bring almost the same costs for the economy of the country. Therefore, it is very important to pay attention with what is going on in Moldova. And basically, what IMF is doing in its relationship with our government is putting a lot of attention to methodology, for example, on how prices are established, and at the same time how to solve the problem of debts, which are very huge, and sometimes they appear to be actually the biggest problem, but not the only one. So as I was mentioning, and here I fully agree with my colleague about the dependence on Russia, it's actually a big issue related to threats that Moldova should address with the help of European Union and also the US, of course. So a lot of issues which are related to energy vulnerabilities, they become automatically leverage which Russia can use in order to influence political decisions and influence the way the country is developing. So in gas sector we have interesting and at the same time alarming situation. It's about 100% dependence. So in 2015 we started to import some very small amount. It's about 1% of the need that Moldova has from Romania. But in order to import more, we need to step up with the interconnection. So this is a big issue. Emerging debts that I mentioned in the very beginning, it is because of the fact that Transnistrian regime is not paying actually for the gas that they consume, though it is very profitable because it is used for their economy and also for supporting social policies that they have in the region. Sometimes, you know, I have heard people in Chisinau on the right bank that they are very keen to actually move to the left bank because actually the bills are smaller. So basically they created this paradise, which few times was for me very bizarre because actually the region is not that safe, let's say, but at the same time it is attractive because of these social elements. 90% of this 80% of GDP, because we speak about a debt which is about $6 billion, and this is about 80–90% of Moldova GDP. So 90% of this amount is actually generated by the Transnistrian region. So you can imagine how this free riding principle, which is very much used by the separatist regime, is working for the region. So the third element is actually the excessive influence of Gazprom. Gazprom is influential in Moldova because it has about 64% of shares in the company Moldova Gas, which actually buy the gas from Russia. So we have a very interesting vertical control of Gazprom. Because via Moldova Gas, it controls not only the supply, but also the distribution and the transmission. So actually, all elements which create the gas system are somehow directly or indirectly controlled by Gazprom, which is a big issue, of course, because you cannot take independent decisions. And taking into account that we have very weak institutions like the regulatory energy body, then of course you imagine how decisions are taken. So electricity, I would say that is not that dependent and is not that catastrophic as gas sector, because we have about 20% of production based on internal capacities. So we are not importing everything from something which is controlled by Russia. And saying something, I mean the power plant which is situated in the same Transnistrian region, which is a breakaway region. And actually we bought from there for many years about 80% of our needs. So again, this power plant is controlled by InterOAS, which is another Russian giant. So again, Russia indirectly control the electricity, because without Transnistrian region, before this year, we couldn't actually supply enough electricity for our needs. So it's a small country, interestingly, but with very huge problems. So therefore, the vulnerabilities which are in the energy sector create a lot of shortcomings in other sectors, including the economy as a whole. So poor energy governance It is about how actually shady schemes are working. And saying about shady schemes, I again recall about Transnistrian region, because many things which are related to indirect control of Russia is somehow linked to this region where actually Russia dominate the political process. They have their army, which is located there from the Soviet times. They have a military. They have soldiers who are actually part of the peacekeeping mission in the region. So they have fully fledged tools to influence the region, including via economic assets, like having, for example, control on the only power plant producer, an electricity producer in the region. So shady schemes, as I mentioned, reminds me about having traders like Energocapital. So it's a very, very peculiar Moldovan story, but having traders which are actually selling electricity from the Transnistrian region and without any sort of supervision or enough control from our regulatory body creates very shaky situations when you are not sure, will they be reliable suppliers or not, who actually control them, where they actually siphon the money. Are they giving only to the regime, or they're also sending via Moldovan banks money to offshore companies? And here we see a big scheme where I actually have a lot of elements that actually create this lack of predictability. You have a lot of unknown questions, unknown answers. So the future is future scenarios. Actually, Russia, in my view, can use these vulnerabilities in order to impose itself. But it depends when it will need to do that. So so far they're in a watch and wait and watch situation. So basically, the gas sector, I think it's very vulnerable because we have historical debt. As I was mentioning, it's about 80% of our GDP. So when they will decide to weaponize this tool, it will be a big problem because we will lose all assets that we have in the sector, and at the same time, Gazprom will become the only, actually the hegemon over the sector. It also will put in danger the interconnections that we are building now with Romania and with the European money. So it's a big issue again. As I mentioned in the second bullet point, so imports from Romania will be actually endangered because we will need to pay the debts back, and it will mean to give away our assets which are not yet in their control. So as well, we should speak about the unbundling principle, which is related to third energy package. And here we have this postponement of implementing the unbundling principle because of Russia, because of the pressure that it put on Moldovan government a few years ago. So it was a decision taken in order to actually have an exemption for Moldova. And we will see how things will evolve after 2019, when actually we will have the ending of the contract that we prolonged this year for 3 years with Russia on supplies of gas. And again, the political situation, when I was raising the issue of pro-Russian politicians in Moldova, this is a problem because we have a president which is clearly supporting Russian rhetoric in Moldova, and he mentioned for a few times that when we will need to pay back historical debts, then we will pay with our assets, including probably the asset that we are building now together with Romanians or Europeans. Electricity, for me, it's as well an important sector, even if it's more liberalized than the gas sector. So actually, we need to, and Russia will lose a position if we will continue with transparent bids. We started this year with the help of energy community and European delegation to open the bids, to make them more transparent, and in this way to reduce the maneuver for the shady schemes or for the let's say vested interests. But at the same time, we need to continue our interconnections with Romania, and this is very important. And in my recommendations, in the last slide, I will mention about that. So conclusions: diversification remains a very important tool. It is not only about building interconnection with Romania, but it's also about connecting Moldova and Ukraine with the energy, electricity transportation system. It's a long process, but it needs a lot of political willingness. So again, I'm coming back to leadership. What kind of leadership we have in these countries? So the third package, it is crucial for liberalizing the market. Moldova, we have a very interesting regulatory body which is always trying to convince me that our market is liberalized. It is not true, actually, because we have still the dominant position of Gazprom via Moldova Gas. We still have big problems related to how to ensure the access of Romanian suppliers, for example, to Moldovan system. Yes, we adopted some secondary legislation which allows this in a legal way. But if you read very carefully these regulations that were adopted recently, you'll find out actually that Moldova Gas and Gazprom can impose themselves so that only they can deliver, actually. The full capacity for delivery will remain for Moldova Gas and Gazprom. So we should be careful how actually this third package is implemented, not only by passing some laws, but actually how in practical manner they are put in practice. So excluding offshore companies is again very important. I explained to you this scheme, this huge scheme was involving some traders which are created from by the separatist region in Moldova, and how they actually have a good cooperation with some oligarchs in Moldova who control some banks, and via these banks, how this money are actually sent to some offshores. So we should pay attention to dismantling and actually via legislation prohibiting in strategic sectors offshore to activate. And reforming the energy body regulator, myself and Otilia, we used to speak about that very much when we go to Moldova, because a lot of things depends on how actually the regulator acts. So we can implement very good laws and secondary legislation, and we can have even energy community very active in Moldova. But if this body, it is not really autonomous, it is not financially independent, then we will have problems with ensuring competition on the market, because everything depends on regulator. And last but not least, we should have assistance and conditionality from EU and the US. So in my view, the European Union is important because it's closer, but at the same time we have a lot of programs which are run by US government. So I believe that those investment programs should include conditionalities which are related to energy sector. We have USAID, which is very active. So we should embrace a lot of conditionality, even if we speak about development projects. At the same time, we need to see clear teaming up of European Union and the US when we want to implement the third energy package. Let's not forget that actually to have the implementation of the unbundling principle, it's an issue of very huge political pressure. So when Filat, the former prime minister, who is now in jail, by the way, for 9 years, he will stay there. So when he gave up with implementing this principle, he was clearly saying that they have pressure from Gazprom. So sometimes Moldova is feeling so small because it doesn't have, let's say, partners who are also getting creating, let's say, a coalition when we talk to Russia. And at the same time, we need to have also a lot of attention and a lot of money channeled to infrastructure which will connect Moldova with Romania. So we should keep talking about diversification, but also about how speeding them up, because 2019, when we have the end of the current Moldova-Russia gas supply contract, will be a next, let's say, crisis year. So we should be ready and prevent some consequences. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think we'll do the same as we prepare for the next question. Denise, I like how you started off by saying when it comes to why the United States should care about energy in this part of the world, it is because energy questions are security questions, and they're hard to disentangle. I also really liked how you focused on debt as a byproduct of dependence. This is not unique to Moldova. It's certainly an issue shared by European energy consumers, specifically Hungary and others, that debt is a tool of Russian influence. I liked the selection of what nows, like what do we do about it? But I would ask you as we go to our final stretch here to think about this question for our audience. If we had to pick one area to focus our attention, and there are many, what area should we look at in order to assist Moldova in breaking this orbit of Russian energy dependence? Is it on the legal or regulatory side? Is it to double down on the Romanian relationship? Or is it the role of the free market to allow for alternatives to Russian-owned companies to import gas from Moldova's neighbors? What, in your view, is the one area where the minimal amount of energy could produce the maximal amount of effect in helping to free Moldova of its dependence? Think about that, and then we will move on. I have been keeping track of our time. I think we're still on a good path, but I would encourage our final two panelists, I'll give you extra time in the Q&A. If you could summarize and be direct in your formal presentation. So, next.
I'll better go up there.
Okay.
I just think it's better hearing from here. I'm speaking as a representative of Chatham House, also of Free Russia Foundation, which is basically a voice of remaining Russian liberal democratic opposition. And some of them are actually speaking out against Putin's policy on energy inside Russia. And that's what I wanted to start with. Why are we even discussing this problem? How is it possible that bankrupted Russia in 1990s became so influential under Putin? And obviously it's with the help of rising commodity prices, and there are different accounts about this, but very roughly speaking, under Putin, around $2 trillion have been earned in natural resources industries, and according to different accounts, and you can calculate it in different ways, and there are disputes about it, but just to give you a sense, experts that I believe, they think that about a quarter to half of it has been stolen or accumulated into essentially power structures or oligarchic structures, criminal networks, as these things are now very difficult to distinguish. And a lot of this money has been moved into offshore accounts, and it has started to be implemented and invested not only inside Russia or former Soviet space, but globally, really. And this brings me to two things that I wanted to highlight, is that when Russian opposition speaks about these issues, we try to distinguish within Kremlin and Russia, and just to show you that there are still some dissenting voices about it, and that we look at how this whole sort of attitude to energy appeared in the first place. And there is a great whole set of investigations about energy sector done by Vladimir Milov, late Boris Nemtsov, in their reports about Putin and Gazprom. There have been investigations by Alexei Navalny. There's been a very interesting documentary about called Who is Mr. Putin, who has been on Radio Liberty websites and interviews It actually shows that, say, Alexei Miller, current CEO of Gazprom, was in the team with Vladimir Putin in St. Petersburg in 1990s. And that's where they learned how to use criminal networks and KGB networks of the city to monopolize local city market. And by the time they came to power in Kremlin, they already have this group of people, these networks, they have headed by Putin. He's been really a mastermind behind many of these schemes with St. Petersburg Airport, St. Petersburg Port, supply of oil products to the city, schemes with oil products coming from Kirishi refinery, where Timchenko and the whole Gunvor originate. And they replicated it throughout the country. And this is very important to bear. When we talk about Russia's subversion in Europe, it's really about current leadership and current Kremlin's subversion rather than Russian necessarily, because Russian people themselves have been robbed of this huge amount of money, and they haven't seen that much. It's been really passed on to them on a residual basis. And so after this sort of disclaimer, I want to quickly go through 7 points that I want to make very brief. So I think one of the biggest problems is that actually Western law enforcements have been not prepared for various reasons to deal with this new situation. FBI, in a way, has been sitting, FBI and Europol, they have been sitting on this information about KGB and criminal networks, including in energy, since at least 2010. We know it from WikiLeaks, through publishing, through meetings of, say, Spanish prosecutor Gonzalez in 2010, where he brought information. Spain has been quite advanced in prosecuting Russian criminal networks, which overlap with the circles I mentioned before. There are different reasons, but it's not like this information about subversion and criminal networks is missing from the West. It is there, it's just not being acted on. Secondly, of course, there is and we know that also through sanctions, which have been quite relaxed. No one mentioned that Gazprom and Rosneft are mentioned in European and US sanctions. In my view, not enough. They're just superficial. The only thing that really hits Russian monopolies is prohibition of long-term loans. But otherwise, Sechin travels to London and to Houston, to energy conferences. They still make deals. It's nothing remotely, for example, as like with Iran, where Western energy companies were told to move out because of the nuclear threat. Another thing of another huge area of negligence from the West about Russian energy subversion is obviously offshore accounts, which have been mentioned in many presentations here. All of these Russian investments or post-Soviet investments, they're not coming directly from Russia or, say, Kazakhstan or other corrupt states. They come from Cyprus, BVI, etc. Nothing is done really about that. It's a huge problem. There is kleptocracy initiative here in Hudson Institute. There are all sorts of anti-corruption networks here in Washington discussing it. It's a huge, vital problem for the Western democracy in many, many areas, not only in Europe. Thirdly, there are obviously very strong allies that Kremlin gets in Europe. Not only Western corporations, especially like big oil and gas majors, especially in Germany, but also most of Russian state or companies friendly to Kremlin, they open their trading houses in Switzerland, Glencore, Gunvor, Lukoil, or in London as Gazprom. And they operate freely, and they all sort of wear a hat of, completely like private businesses, Western businesses. In current environment, I think this should be treated more like, as was the case with Iran and its intermediaries. because we have a war with Ukraine, which was initiated by Russia, and it's a completely different security environment, something that has been mentioned in all the presentations today. Another thing which hasn't been mentioned enough to my taste is the extent of specifically of energy propaganda that Russian companies and Russian intermediaries employ in Europe. We have heard about Russians staging protests about shale gas, but in Romania and Bulgaria, which is true. But I would take it much further. Obviously, disinformation has been talked a lot about Russia, but not about energy. There are sustained discussions which relate to energy, about overpaying for renewables, subsidies to sectors which Russians don't like, about all sorts of disinformation about interconnectors and Brussels plans in these Eastern European countries that Russia has an interest in. Another set of myths are very interesting. Say Rosatom. For many years it's been presented as if like it's run by a liberal, sort of systemic liberal Kiriyenko, who is now head of presidential administration. Well, there have been no liberals in proper sense in Russian government under Putin at all. All these people, Kudrin, Chubais, Miller, Kiriyenko, Dvorkovich, they have ties with all sorts of schemes and corruption in Russia dating from 1990s. And in 2000s, under Putin, they have shown their true face, and it should be discussed properly. Another myth is there is no proper market economy or private property in Russia. So to distinguish Lukoil or Alfa Bank or, I don't know, Novatek as supposedly private companies, it's a joke. It's really, they're all connected to Kremlin, they get favors from Kremlin, they run on cash flows. Panama Papers showed that. Many of these oligarchs and these supposedly private properties, they're entangled in all sorts of schemes with Kremlin. And anyone who is trying to act independently, they can't, they don't. And we've seen examples how those who even dare to show some sign of independence, they are suppressed in Russia. Final 2 points. So apart from lack of sanctions, offshore accounts, myths, there are obviously very strong enablers in the West, apart from corporations who have direct capital interest. Russians, because the Russians have so much money, they essentially buy influence through all sorts of areas. Kremlin's playbook study was mentioned from CSS from end of last year. It shows that in Bulgaria, Lukoil has bought so many media outlets directly and like through offshore accounts. It owns it. There are all sorts of lobby and PR companies that Gazprom, Rosneft have hired in Brussels, in Washington, in London. They try to influence even discussions and discourse on these issues. And this brings me to my very final point, which sort of circles back together to my starting point about how all this is possible. All these things that I've discussed so far are sort of short-term to medium-term. In the long term, we in the West should really consider where do we send our money? We buy Russian oil, Russian gas. Europe still remains the main market for Russian gas. Oil is sort of global. It's a global market for Russia. Well, maybe we should really consider and stop subsidizing this criminal regime, which is very aggressive to its neighbors, because really the current price which we now pay, say for Norwegian gas or for Russian gas, it doesn't reflect that difference. So in the long term, maybe there should be some sort of fiscal measures to reflect that, or sanctions.
Okay,
Thanks.
Ilya, thank you very much. Soren, do you have a presentation in analog or digital? Okay, so
from over here.
okay,
Michael,
wonderful.
if
Well,
you allow.
before you get started, Ilya, I really responded very strongly and positively to what you were saying. If I got it correctly, you started off with a wow number, talking about $2 trillion, which Russia under Putin has generated through exports of resources, much of that stolen. This highlights the links between crime and energy dealings and law enforcement. When you look ahead, when we look forward, I guess this is my question to you. In your opinion, how effective would it be if Western law enforcement agencies trained to ferret out, to seize assets and ferret out dirty money in the West, those in the same way that NATO trains for military exercises? SNAP, forfeiture and seizure exercises in the financial sector. You don't have to do them, but you have to train for them. How effective do you think these kinds of demonstration effects would be in helping us get our own handle on the dirty money Russian energy creates in the West? Think about that as Soren goes to his presentation, and we'll come back.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I'm so glad that Ilya spoke before me, because it allows me to build on exactly what he said and to challenge you with, I hope, provocative and probably a little bit utopian proposal about what is to be done. But before that, I'll start just addressing head-on your initial question. So why do we care here in Washington, or in Brussels, or in Ottawa, or I don't know where, about the East, this part of Eastern Europe? Well, let me be a little bit philosophical, because it's a very big mirror in front of us in which we see our other self. And it allows us, to reflect on something which is very deep. How extraordinary it is at historical scale to have in a human society like here in the United States or in other parts of the Western world, prosperity, rule of law, stable institution, and respect for individuals. This is something unique. This is something very new at the historical, in historical terms. This is probably 0.0001 of the whole history of humankind, and it was built with effort. It didn't grow in trees. We didn't pick it up from somewhere, and it must be defended every day. This is what we called before the model of the rule of law, by which we are governed here in this world, and we hope to be governed in Eastern Europe, in the new member states, and in Moldova, in Ukraine, and everywhere. We speak about the benefits of cooperation. This is something terribly new. We realize this very recently. We speak about depoliticized institutions that ensure neutral rules of operation for everyone, whether companies or individuals. This is something that didn't come from history. It's something very recent. What is on the other hand? On the other hand is a bazaar model of governance, where you bargain at every point, where there's opacity, where it's zero-sum games, where my gain is your loss and the other way around, where at some point you even sacrifice profit as a company or as a state in order to hurt the other one, or in order to achieve something else, which is a strategic or political goal. This is non-commercial behavior. This used to be normality, for a large part of our history, and you can still live there. So where do I want to get from here? This is a world of Hobbes. It's a very Hobbesian world, and it's not just Russia, which is openly advocating for it. It's also China. No? So they are not the only ones who propose the alternative model. What is new these days is that they don't actually argue that this model, let's say model E, the bazaar model, is superior. They don't say that anymore, as in the times of the Soviet Union. So there's not actually a competition of models. What they say is that model B does not exist. The cooperation model does not exist. So this is what we hear today from the propaganda. It's just that this is some hypocritical nonsense coming from the West. You are actually like us. You are just more hypocritical and you don't admit it. We are all the same, you know. We are just more honest with the Russians because we tell you what you do. We occupy things, we try to make deals, you know, and you do the same. Whether Gazprom comes in our country or an Austrian company comes in my country, it's the same thing actually, and the effects will be the same. It's just, it's me and it's not you, or the other way around. It plays actually on this cynical relativism, and this is very catchy with East European publics because people come from decades where they heard the same propaganda actually. Communism was the same propaganda, was very relativistic. There are no values, there is no morality actually. We are all the same, we play strategic games. But again, what is new in our region, there are some political leaders who, under democracy, because in Hungary we have free and fair elections, in Romania we have free and fair elections, by and large, they found a way actually to exploit democratic rules and to play democracy against the rule of law model. And this is a danger. If they manage to persuade more than half of the public that the other model is better, and that model is voted, then we have a big problem. We must build, be more efficient in building a constituency for the good governance model, which is relatively new in the region. And what we spoke about today, which is the energy policy, is just an illustration of this. So the story is broader, but you can take sectors. And energy is a very good one because you have internal policies, industrial policies, but you also have a relationship between countries on which you can play. You can have direct intervention like they did in Crimea or in Transnistria, but more often you have encouragement for domestic actors in all our countries who argue or have a direct interest in promoting the alternative model, you know, the Hobbesian model, to promote populist industrial policies that impoverish the public, the very public of the country. But the propaganda makes the public think that this is a good one, or maybe the only model possible. And, you know, and the cooperation is something which was invented by some people in Brussels just because they want to colonize us by the different means. This is actually the struggle that we must fight. And my provocative proposal is the following. Well, in some countries, we must be better at arguing our case because, you know, to borrow a sentence about the rule of law, about justice, it must not only be done, but be seen by the public to be done, you know. So we must be more persuasive in explaining the public that this is better than that, you know. But how about turning the table against Russia and address these constituencies that Ilya was speaking about? Let's talk to the Russian citizens and the Russian commercial operators. There are private companies which are present in my country, for example. Lukoil was mentioned before. Well, when they broke the rules, they got a penalty. But now they exist, they operate commercially, and nobody has a problem with that. There were big investors in the steel industry. It was not a success case because steel industry has problems, like everywhere in the world and in the European Union. But at least they operated commercially. So many Russian companies, Russian citizens vote with their feet or with a passport, or they want to secure their assets and their families in the space of the rule of law. So this shows that they know which model works better, actually. And they vote for it in very practical terms. Why don't we try to address them more directly, which is something we don't do? I mean, instead of being defensive all the time and speaking of Russian propaganda coming after us, why don't we go over there and speak to the Russian citizens? Look, you are impoverished because what they do, they use Gazprom, they use, you know, these rents for subsidizing Belarus. And what are you in the Russian community left with? You are poorer for that than you should otherwise be, you know, if you follow this other model. So let's try to bring European Union into this space. I'm not that naive to propose to change the Russian public institutions or state-owned companies, but let's start with private actors, or let's look into countries like Ukraine and Moldova, where they are present in many forms, and try to buy them, to buy them into the rule of law space. So that would be my proposal. It's not easy, I know. It's a bit fantastic, but why don't we speak about it? You know, just for a change, because I sort of feel we are too defensive, and we don't put our case very clearly many times. Energy policy is a very good testing ground. Let's talk to them about how much they lose for not being part of the rule of law space. And for Russia, for Ukraine, for Transnistria, for the European Union is the closest space they can be in. But Washington can help in many ways.
Thank you, Soren. All right, so we have about 20 minutes left. Soren, I like how your comments put a capstone on the formal presentations of the panel here today. To answering that question, that this region matters because here we have a shared legacy that is worth defending. It's a very powerful point. And I also liked how you rejected the zero-sum calculations and cynical relativism that Russian propaganda helps to put out. And you pointed in the direction of what now? And this is my question for you then. How can we, as policymakers in the West, as experts in the West, look to, for example, Romania's experiences as a way of normalizing the energy field? So think through that one. Here's what we're going to do. I will give each one of our panelists the hardest task as moderator I can, and that is to summarize your answer into 1 minute. After that, we will take questions from the audience, and we will wrap up. So with that in mind, Dennis, what does success in Ukraine look like? How do we break those chains between energy and corruption? If you can do it in 1 minute, you get a Nobel Prize.
$1 million. Actually, you're quite right in combining those two issues on combating the corruption and breaking up the ties of around the politics. This is exactly what we should do right now, and by saying that I mean to double our efforts on combating the systematic corruption in Ukraine, which basically roots in the large state-owned companies. But on the bright side, and picking up on where we dropped the first panel, Ukraine is in not a bad position because we are moving right way, and I think that actually we need to do what we are doing, but probably on the better pace. And of course, if I have 10 seconds left, no success would be in Ukraine until we are back to the constitutional borders, and I guess that provides for no Russians on the territory, no proxies on the territory, and regaining the borders again, which is not that easy to do, I'm afraid. Thanks.
So solving the conflict is also key.
Absolutely.
Okay, Alexei, how does Belarus break free of this quid pro quo cycle, and what role is there for the West?
I was thinking about the previous question. What is being exchanged for those rents? Very little, actually, surprisingly very little. Yes, we sold Beltransgas, the national gas pipe system, but we sold it more or less for 3 times of its price tag. If you count all the discounts, we received around 11 billion for what is worth 4 billion. Otherwise, this was the exchange of hugs and kisses for oil and gas, more or less. So perhaps something else is yet to come, but for the time being, the Lukashenko gave very little in exchange for getting a lot. How do we get out of this vicious circle? If the West is serious, the West should offer more than what Belarus gets from Belarus. This is a cynical answer from Russia, because for the time being, it looks like Moscow is making the deals, the offer which Lukashenko cannot refuse, and Brussels is making the offers which Lukashenko cannot understand. Some sort of very vague policies, vague frameworks, and vague programs in which the Belarusian incumbent just doesn't see the cash flow opportunity. So he is more or less entitled to playing according to the European rules and sticking to more or less a normal civilized dress code, but without deep understanding what it really gets to him. How the situation, how Belarus is going to break free, probably the situation worsens, and probably the only stimulus for reforms. Basically in our countries, nobody is doing reforms because they want to make things better. In our countries, policymakers are pursuing reforms because not doing it is impossible. So it's not the choice between good and better, it's the choice between the worst and the terrible. So in a way, with the deteriorating status quo, with insolvent economy and with the economic crisis, sooner or later, they will have to more or less stop subsidizing the state-owned enterprises, higher unemployment, structural reforms, and there would be the room for further Western leverage and linkage, if, of course, Russia doesn't provide us with any more anesthesia with which we can afford not reforming at all.
Okay, excellent. Denise, probably the hardest one to do in 60 seconds, but when it comes to Moldova, where should we put our focus? What gets us the biggest bang for our policy buck, as it were?
Actually, I believe that there is no one solution. It should be a complex measures, and basically the accent should be put on reforming the regulatory body. So give the real freedom to the regulatory, and also let's focus on interconnections, because without that we cannot diminish in no way the dependence on Russia. These two elements are crucial, but not the only one.
And Ilya, what's the role for law enforcement in the West? What would be effective, and how can we begin to address the dirty money in our own system that is created through these non-transparent Russian energy dealings?
I mean, so far, West has really acted very superficially, even after start of war in Ukraine. So Adam Zubin from State Department couple of years ago said that Putin is personally corrupt, and this is why we sanctioning this particular trading house with Timchenko. But that was really the only big statement on corruption from US authorities. While I know they sit on so much more information, as do Europol. I think some exemplary arrests, exemplary cases, would do a lot, because we already seen that very comparatively to the whole system in Russia, these relatively small investigations in about Magnitsky case, about Spanish prosecution case, these sanctions, they already did waves in Russian system and followed up with many reports, investigations. Imagine if, so right now it's like 1% that has been acted on. Imagine if at least, 5 to 10 of information would be acted on. So I believe there is a multiplier effect from even small part of investigations.
So a whiff of legal grape shot would have a multiplier effect to mix. Okay. Sorin, how can we learn from what Romania has done? Are there lessons we can learn for normalizing the energy market? What can we learn from Romania's experience?
I think what we learn from Romania, we learn from the whole region of Central Eastern Europe, and that is that in spite of all the flaws and difficulties today, I don't remember of any similar success story in the modern history of countries overcoming difficulties in just 25 years and achieving such a success like these countries which are now part of the European Union, maybe with the exception of South Korea and Taiwan, for similar growth in a very short. We should not be ashamed to say that. And probably the best kids in class are the Baltic states, and if they did it in 25 years, including in the energy sector, I think they are the most shocking success story compared with what was written in the media at the beginning of transition, and the bad predictions existing then, if they could do it, everybody can do it. And I think we should say it more often and in a more optimistic way, including to the remainders of the liberal Russian society. They are still there, and they are like us, and they are in a terrible situation, actually.